This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, thanks. So I'll start again. So I think, as I said, from a COVID perspective, the whole digitalization journey for the payments ecosystem in India has accelerated, right? It also brings a lot of challenges to us and as well as opportunities. So in this session, my agenda will be to touch a bit about for 5 minutes, like how the digital payments in India have progressed, and then what are the regulations, current regulations around payment regulations in India, and what is the future. I will also talk about a bit of Indian context with respect to data privacy. What are the laws which are right now kind of enforced, right, by the government of India, and then under what regulations all the entities of Indian entities work, right, under what regulations, and then the future, right? So which is the personal data protection bill, right, which is actually pending in the parliament, which is inspired from GDPR of Europe, right? So I'll touch base upon what the DPB is, right? What is the framework? What is the architecture? And then we'll also talk about that why is it still not passed, even because it is like proposed in 2018. We are sitting in 2022. So 4 year hence also we are not seeing, I mean, this bill has not seen the light. And what are the issues and criticisms that it has faced, and what is the the status right now. And then we'll conclude the presentations and then Q&A, right? So just to quickly start, right, with the fintech revolution, right? So as you know, as I said, the whole digitalization process has actually accelerated the advances in technology. So we have new frameworks coming in. We have new kind of UI frameworks, new programming languages, faster CPUs, very cheap memory, right? All of that came together to make sure that the whole financial services space is also transforming at a very speedy process, right? And then it gives birth to new processes, products, applications, and business models. So if you see some of the legacy, right, in the 80s, we had actually the automation of paper-based clearing system, right? So we had purely paper-based systems. So we actually automated in 80s. When we came to 90s, we actually introduced electronic fund transfer system and electronic clearing services. And that's the time when we issued the debit and credit cards in India, right? And from 2000s, right, if you see, the whole value proposition was focused on innovation, and a lot of new payment systems took birth in India, starting from SEFT, which was a precursor to NEFT. Then we have RTGS in 2003, and then the check truncation system, right, which was introduced in 2005, with NEFT introduced in 2004 March. What happened is after this, right, the whole domain changed with the birth of NPCI. So government actually started an entity and had put it some fund for the payments innovation in India under one umbrella entity. And with 2010-11, it started with these innovations, right? So we started with National Financial Switch. So if you go to the ATM and if you have a HDFC bank account and you are withdrawing the money from SBI, thank this National Financial Switch, which is able to do or transact that seamlessly, right? We had IMPS, which is more mobile to mobile payments, seamless payments, right? And then the whole Aadhaar enabled payment systems, which actually revolutionized the rural economy. Because if somebody has an Aadhaar, he can actually go to a kiosk and show his Aadhaar with biometric, and he can actually make a payment anywhere in India, right? Bank to bank payments. With this, I think 2012 was an era when RuPay and all came in, right? So the RuPay and the National Automated Clearing House, and also a USSD based mobile banking service, which is star 99 hash, right? So there's a very famous service which came in and was used by millions of people at time. And then I think this was a period when 2016-17, when everybody was hooked onto UPI. And if you see the whole revolution which UPI has created, because now a lot of other countries are actually asking this technology from India, right? So the whole Bharat interface for money, QR code and UPI together have put India on a global scale or map on payments domain. And if you see 2018-19, we have the architecture of UPI 2.0 ready, and also the National Common Mobility Card, which was enabled by RuPay, right? So if you travel on a metro or bus, if you're shopping, you can just take this mobility card and everything will be enabled on this, right? So all these innovations of NPCI has put India, right? And then some of these acts and regulations I will talk about in the next slide, which have enabled, and government of India has been very supportive and is very forward looking when it comes to giving India a flip or a movement towards future. So I'll speak about these, right, in the next slide. So this is how I think the whole payment regulation in India works right now, right? So we had the first bill coming in, which is called Payment Systems and Settlement Act of 2007, right, which actually comprised of two major regulations. So, and both these regulations are headed by RBI. So there is a Board for Regulation and Supervision of Payment and Settlement Systems Regulation, which is BPSS, and Payment and Settlement System Regulations 2008. So what happened is RBI actually said that all the payment entities in India have to be regulated by RBI, and also they said that they actually created new entities in turn, right? And if you see how payment systems in India have evolved, so it started with a payment system, right, which is enabling a payment to be effected between a payer and a beneficiary, right? So the whole process of clearing payment and settlement. Then coming to PSPs, which is called payment service providers. So both banks and non-banks are PSPs, but the non-bank PSPs can only access through a member bank. So if you transact on Amazon, you can actually do it on the rails of Axis Bank because they have collaborated with Axis. So the definition is both bank and non-bank can be PSPs, but PSPs can only transact through a member bank. And coming to payment banks, right? So this was kind of in of 11 licenses which were given initially. So payment banks can accept amount deposits kind of services with respect to a full-fledged, fully operating bank, right? So they can offer remittance services, mobile payments, net banking, and third-party transfers. Okay, so if you see, still by this time, right? I mean, like we had payment bank, we have PSPs, we have very advanced infrastructure. Still, we had these issues with respect to how payments are being done in India, right? So first is the tech neutrality, right? So I mean, everybody had to kind of subject to whatever RBI is giving in the regulation, saying, okay, this is how the tech stack should be, right? So everybody has to agree to it. There are still barriers to entry because there are very limited licenses which were given, and the conditions are a bit harsher for newer entities. And restricted innovation because it is still subject to what NPCI and some of the other regulatory bodies are kind of giving as a framework, so people can operate under those frameworks. So what happened is that Payment and Settlement Systems Bill of 2018 was introduced, right? And this bill is also kind of underway to actually this is not passed yet, but I think this is again in works between RBI and some of the other payment entities, right, which are regulated by RBI. So what this bill will do is this will eliminate some of the shortcomings of all the previous shortcomings in the Act of PSS 2007. So they are saying that we need to establish an independent payment regulatory board which will seek to foster competition, consumer protection, systemic stability, and resilience in payment sector. So they want this to be more innovative. They want to open up this sector more, right? The payment regulatory board can be an independent payment regulator, but kind of there is a formal mechanism for coordination for regulation of payments, right? So RBI will still be kind of the whole kind of chairing the whole committee of PRB, the Payment Regulatory Payment Regulatory Board, but there will be more openness. The regulations will be more lenient, right? For payment players to be more innovative and then can operate with their own tech stack and other things. This bill is still under works, right? So there was also a note saying that RBI should not be managing this, and there should be an independent entity. So RBI actually issued a dissent note saying that this should remain with RBI, right? So there was also a talk of having a payment regulatory board which is different than RBI, right? Should not be led by RBI, right? So this is still under works, and this is where the whole payments space in India is right now. Now, coming to the whole data privacy around payments and some of the other stuff, right? If you see the evolution, right, it started with Information Technology Act 2000, right? It's still prevalent. A lot of cases are still being filed under IT Act of 2000. But if you see the provisions, they are related to cyber and related IT laws, and the scope of access that an individual might have is on the data stored on a computer system or computer network. Right. So the scope of IT Act is very limited and very primitive, right? So I think in 2000, this act may have worked fine because not everybody had a digital device in the hand. But with 2022, I think this has become obsolete, right? What happened then is an amendment came in, right, in 43 and 72A, which actually provided a right to compensation for improper disclosure of personal information, right? So there was a bit of improvement with respect to the right to compensation. And then moving forward, there were some additional requirements which came in, like information technology, reasonable security practice and procedure, and sensitive personal data information. So now in 2011, in section 43, I think we also introduced a term called sensitive personal data, right, which included the health of the individual, the financial status, the sex, and some of the other, right, basic sensitive information of an individual, right? And then still all these with all this evolution, right, we still had a lot of gap with respect to how privacy is actually seen. And if you come down in 2017, Supreme Court passed a right to privacy as a fundamental right under the framework of the right to life. So if you see the Constitution under Article 21, there was a case called K.S. Puttaswamy versus Union of India, right? So 2017, it was the first time that Supreme Court said right to privacy is also a fundamental right. And then I think with this started talks of how can we build privacy as part of daily lives, right? So I think the whole story became very kind of I mean very serious, because I think what is privacy, and right when Supreme Court declared that you have a right to privacy, nobody had a right definition of privacy. So there was a need to put the right framework in place, right, to actually support what privacy means in India, right? And hence, I think there was a framework which is called GDPR, right, in Europe. And India took some motivation from that and then drafted. So Ravi Shankar Prasad first in 2019 tabled a bill which is called Data Protection Bill, right? And what this bill is different is it actually set the consent of the individual as the most important factor for data sharing. So if you have the data and you have given your data to an organization, suppose you are transacting on a payment application like a Paytm or MobiKwik or anything, if you don't give consent for the data to be shared further, those entities can't share it, right? So that becomes the whole kind of framework, and it becomes the base of the whole data protection bill, that the person who owns the data, if he's not giving a consent, the organizations cannot use that data for any purposes, right? Like for marketing, for there's a lot of this data is also sold for advertising purposes. And if you scroll your Facebook, I think today it's all AI based, right? So whatever you chat, whatever you talk on your mobile phones, or actually reflect in the advertisements that you see in your profile, right? Because every data is actually shared, right? So this right to privacy bill, right, will actually help give a bit of privacy in those terms. So as I said, it's a fundamental right as defined in 2017. And unless the users have furnished their consent explicitly, the personal data related to individual will not be shared or processed, right? So that's the most important thing. It's the pillar of this whole bill. Adding to this DPB, right? So right now the status is that it's referred to a joint select committee, right? It's not yet passed in the parliament, and I'll talk about why, what are the shortcomings and what are the issues in the bill. But in addition to that, I think if you see the whole privacy thing and the whole financial inclusion space, we have Aadhaar Act as well, which is supporting all of this. So this was a money bill, right, which gave a legal backing to the whole UIDAI, right, which is the organization managing Aadhaar. And we also have RTI, right, of 2005, which actually mandates the timely response to citizen requests for government information, right? So if you see the whole gamut of laws which are working together to actually make data privacy successful in India, right? So in this slide, I think I talked about the IT Act of 2000, right, which is still prevalent. A lot of cases are still filed under it. But as you move in, I think we have progressed towards a space where uh, it also depends on the consent of individual. Okay. So I think just to conclude, right? So DPB is very unique opportunity for India, a country with some 740 million internet users, right? And to forge a path-breaking agenda, right, in the field of national data protection. Now, as I said, it's inspired from inspired from GDPR, right? So if you see the territorial scope of, and I've just given some examples of how we have kind of translated some of the GDPR definitions, but I've also attached a document which speaks about the whole paper about how GDPR and the personal data protection are similar and different, right, in various terms. So I've just touched upon, but I've also, due to paucity of time, I've attached a paper for you to refer later. So if you see, GDPR is the territorial scope is European Union, right? And companies offering goods and services to European Union. And it also used for monitoring the behavior of individuals in EU, right? So any entities which are monitoring the behavior. The subject matter here is the personal data and of an identified or identifiable natural person. And here the three entities are controller, processor, and data subject. So controller is an entity which is a natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or body that alone or jointly with others determine the purpose and meaning of processing of personal data, right? So these are the organizations which are defining the purpose of personal data. Processor is basically a natural legal person and authority or agency which processes the personal data on behalf of controller. And data subject is actually an identified or identifiable natural person, basically an individual whose data is being processed. And if you see some of the similarities of how we have defined this in personal data protection bill, we are calling a data subject a data principal, right? We are calling a processor a data processor, and we are calling a controller data fiduciary. And that's the definition in your PDP bill. And here it's more related to territory of India, Indian companies and citizens, and any connection with Indian business or individual, right? So very similar to what European Union has done. And if you see the differences, I think the PDPB, which is the Personal Data Protection Bill, also, is a bit broader than GDPR, because even if the entity fall in the scope mainly by processing personal data in India, that will be considered as part of the Personal Data Protection Bill, right? So the rules will apply to that entity as well. And from a subject matter perspective, the the personal data protection bill, it gives government a very broad authority to compel the disclosure of information that doesn't constitute personal data. So one of the demerits of the bill right now is that it gives too much power for government to conduct surveillance on anybody, right? And that's also one of the criticisms of the bill right now. Okay, so moving on, I think this is how it is structured. It's a very heavy slide, so I'll not go much, right? So first is about the law. As I said, any entity under the Indian, which is operating in the Indian jurisdiction, be it government, companies, foreign companies, right? They are all subject to this. And this actually will help in kind of mitigating some of the source of revenue, right? Because companies today are kind of just selling or mis-selling the data very spuriously, right? So it's a source of revenue and very long source of revenue for many people. Potential revenue for invasion of privacy, right? So because there is right now, as I said, there's no framework in India which talks about privacy, right? And companies find it more convincing ways to advertise online, right? So anybody can use anybody's data and then kind of is advertising today using AI and machine learning and some of that stuff, right? So this law will actually mitigate some of those malpractices. Some of the features, right? So as I said, the obligations of data fiduciary. In the previous slide, I talked about who is a data fiduciary. So there'll be a lot of restrictions in the way they will operate, right, from now on. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Power issue, but yeah, I came back.
Oh, yeah. Yes, you can continue.
Yeah. So, from a perspective of, I think the whole obligation of data fiduciary, right? So, I mean, if you see, this bill actually loads a lot of responsibilities to the person who is actually storing the data and who is directing to store the data of the individual, right? There are a lot of security safeguards which are placed, which will make sure that the individual data is protected. There is also an appointment of DPA, which is called, the whole authority, which will actually help the grievance redressal mechanisms, right? So this will be under the Government of India body, right? And they will make sure that you have, any individual can actually go to the DPA and then they can put their grievance. The rights of the individual, which are very clearly defined, the grounds for processing personal data, and consent is provided by the individual, right? So that's the most important aspect of this bill, that consent has to be provided by individual on the data, right? And there are audits being done. There are a lot of the framework also includes a lot of restrictions on where you can place the data. Is it in Indian jurisdiction? Is it outside? Is it so? There are a lot of features which actually protect a user data. The only exemptions is the interest of the security of the state, right? Because the whole security, the apparatus of Government of India and the Union of India, right? Government of India can actually access anything, right? So it gives very blanket approval for Government of India to tap into any data source, right? So that's an exemption here. And then there are offenses which are declared as well. So if companies will not adhere to this DPB bill, right, when it is passed, there are provisions of fines of 15 CR or 4% of company's annual turnover, right, which is like huge for any company. And it's also punishable with a fine of 5 CR, right? So basically, there are a lot of punishments as well for not adhering to in the current form or structure of the bill. Now, because of this very brutal structure, right? I mean, like companies right now who are saving a lot of data, any payment company, any other company, any company who's saving your data, for example, any e-commerce website, any e-commerce portal, right? All of them have to make very serious technical changes in the engineering architecture, because right now they don't have provisions. So some companies may have, right, which are very advanced, but right now most of the companies don't have the right framework for storing the consumer data, right? Because these are very, I mean, these are very it's very demanding kind of rule, right? The companies also have to make sure that there are technical security safeguards on de-identification, right? Because right now, if anybody can see individual identity, right? So tomorrow, nobody will, right? Or depending on how individual gives the consent, only will be revealed. There are also thresholds, right? So thresholds means, suppose there is a social media site, the number of users, right? So how many, depending on the number of users, they will have additional responsibilities in this bill. So suppose if Facebook has 1 billion users, right, on them, I mean, they are subject to more harsher data privacy rules than maybe a Twitter who may have maybe 100 million users, right? So just giving an example. There are very strict rules on individual consent for data transfer abroad, right? So a lot of companies are taking your data, but your data is saved in the cloud somewhere in US, Seattle, or somewhere else, right? A case of Amazon or some of the other companies right now. But this bill actually brings in that there's a lot of rules around data localization, right? So this will also make sure that a lot of companies have to change their data centers, the architecture, all of that data has to be migrated to Indian shores, right, when this comes in. And specifically the sensitive personal data, they have to be stored only in India, right? So you can't take sensitive personal data of individual living in India outside, right? So as I said, somebody's financial condition, health status, some of those factors, right? And any company, when demanded, have to give the government any non-personal data as well, right? So as I said, government has been given a very blanket kind of approval. So as I said, there are merits and there are concerns. The merits are that we need a consent of individual only to the extent necessary, and data localization, right? Some of these merits. But if you see the concerns on the bill, it says a very handful of people, mostly bureaucrats, right, will be a part of this data protection authority, right? And there's a data protection officer, which are mostly government appointed, and bureaucracy right now don't have the capacity to actually look at the cases which may come out of this, right? So there are a lot of concerns that is there a capacity with the government and with the infrastructure that the government has, that they can manage this heavy loading, right? As I said, there's a blanket power of exemption to government. And because we are being protectionist, that we are saying that all the data has to be in India, and some of these other countries will also follow suit and reciprocate the same to India. So if we do the same, if we do this to US companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, those countries will also do the same with us, right? So there may be a backlash from some of those big techs. And we are giving a challenge to globalized competitive internet marketplace. And as we are saying that all the data should be in India and under the jurisdiction of Indian legal laws and some of the stuff, right? So those are some of the concerns. So because of these concerns, there are around 81 amendments and 12 recommendations proposed in the bill, right? Some of these issues are, as I said, issues with data localization. The definition of national security is very, very subjective in the bill right now. The big tech and the startups are opposing because they have to make huge changes in their infrastructure, the way they operate, and maybe the compliance cost may be too much because of this, right? So because it has to go to a major change. And there could be delay in implementation as well, because I think these are very good laws, or maybe in fact the whole framework is good to look by, but I think it takes a lot of time for this kind of major change to take effect. Some of the criticism, as I said, there's also an inclusion of non-personal data in the bill, right, along with the personal data. Regulation of social media companies. Right now, I think people say that the more anonymous it is, I think we can get the issues on the table faster. With the regulation, I think we may not get the kind of agility with the issues that people are raising on social media and stuff. There's also a very big concern around hardware, right? So they said that the bill said that all the hardware has to be signed off by the officers, right? So for example, you are using a personal device, right? I mean, like a company is using some hardware or some data centers. They said a DPO has to approve all that, right? I mean, like with millions of devices, I think this is next to impossible, right? So the definition of trusted hardware and what does that mean, I think it's very, very hazy. There are a lot of concerns about cross-border data flows, because I think what can or cannot move out, and right now a lot of companies store their data outside, right? Like it's in India, data centers are not that much there, though companies are now building it. But if you see Amazon, some of those companies, most of this data actually stored in US, right? And the definition of the classification of data also had some concerns with respect to what is personal data, what is non-personal data, what is sensitive data, right? What is very, very sensitive data, it's all that. But if you see the whole kind of bill, right? So it provides some merits as well. If you see, there are around 80 countries who have already passed laws in collections and use of the citizen data, right? And like we are still not there. Okay, we are still under progress, right? So if this comes in, it will create next $1 trillion opportunity, because I think once this comes in, right, this framework is implemented, we have a lot of opportunities with respect to data privacy. A lot of startups can come around it. A lot of business around privacy itself, right? So it's a huge market that will get opened up, and the creation, use, and sale of data in the DPP will have immense applications on the data usage right now. So anybody can run an algorithm on any data which is bought by any entity, and then can sell the product, right? So after this, there'll be a lot of surveillance, and nobody can just do, because there are fines. If somebody is doing these things, they are actually subject to fines. So just to conclude, I think we are just on time, right? It's a good step towards making privacy very inclusive in Indian society. But with all the suggested amendments, this law will be a path-breaking revolution, right, for next set of digital innovations. So just to conclude, I think if you see there's a $1 trillion opportunity, it's still referred to JPC, right, which is Joint Parliamentary Committee, and a lot of work is still pending. And I think maybe in the next set of sessions, this bill may be introduced with all the amendments and all the recommendations. So thanks a lot. I think that's all I have right now. There's some of the glossary, right, which talks about the bill and what are the various entities and who are the officers and how this bill will run. So that's all from my side. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Shiv. So the audience can raise their hand and ask the questions. Maybe put the questions in the chat boxes.
Can I ask? I haven't
Yes.
typed the question.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Shiv. It was a very good talk. Really enjoyed knowing about the PDP as well as comparisons with GDPR. So I had 2-3 questions. Maybe the first one I wanted to ask is that, see, generally it is written that the consent may be given by an individual for a given purpose, right? Obviously, when they want to share data, right? Use my data for this purpose. Now, how does an entity which is giving data, like say, or a middleware entity like IUDX is a data exchange, and how does an entity like a data exchange ensure technologically that the data is actually being consumed for that purpose only, or is it today the state of the art? Is it like, are there any technology means, or is it just a self-attestation and maybe some kind of a regulatory authority which says that? How do we ensure that?
Sure. I think thanks, Abhay, for the question. I think what I understood the question is that how will you make sure that the data which is collected for the purpose is actually being used for that purpose and not for anything else, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll tell you from my experience, right? I mean, from JP Morgan, from HSBC, from my current experience as well, that when we collect the data, right, we have very clear frameworks why we are collecting the data. So for example, if I'm working in a bank and if I'm running a commercial bank, right, which is to actually give loans and to support the small and medium enterprises for their financial needs, for example, I obviously would have a contract, right, which is signed by them, where it clearly states, right, that this data will be used for 1, 2, 3, right, and apart from that, if we need this data for marketing purposes or whatever, a formal consent would be required. For example, if I am selling a loan to a small and medium enterprise, I generally take consent in that form only, that any marketing related activities, right? If he ticks yes, then yeah, I will do it. If he ticks no, then maybe that data I cannot use for marketing purposes, right? So in a lot of international banks, this has been kind of, this has been implemented at the source itself rather than kind of having problems later. Because when you're collecting the data, that's when I think you need to define what we need to use the data for and why we need to use the data, right? Once I think that framework is set, then I think you can do whatever with the data. What happens with right now with a lot of entities is a lot of entities collect the data, right? And in India, because we don't have a jurisdiction, we don't have this bill right now, the data can be used for all the other purposes, right? So, or maybe, for example, if Facebook is collecting the data, nobody reads the privacy kind of their statement, but we just say, I agree. But if you just open that statement, it will be maybe 2-3 pages statement where it clearly states that, okay, this data will be used for marketing purposes and to sell the products to you, collecting your data, right? So basically a lot of these American companies are very smart. They do it at the source and include all the things that they think will do with the data. So I think we need to be a bit smarter as well, right?
No, but we are not able to ensure that, right? So, I mean, that ensuring of
So then
that
it's a
purpose.
non-compliance. So then it's
Yeah,
a
okay.
non-compliance, right?
Then it's a
So what
non-compliance,
happens
and
is,
that has to be sort of
yes.
done through audits or something, right?
So what happens today in a lot of banks, right? So whenever there is a data breach, we actually in bank call it a data breach. So if I collect the data of somebody and I use it for the purpose, right, it's actually a regulatory breach. And the bank, as per US laws, because I work for US banks, we have to actually give fines. And you can read a lot of news articles, right, around that a lot of American banks, time to time, they submit fines to Federal Bank of US because there could be some data leakage, there could be some malpractice, there could be anything. For example, you would have read a recent use case of a penalty given by a big American bank because they used the data to sell some of the other products. They were upselling and cross-selling some of the other products using the data of a consumer, and they were fined more than $1 billion by Federal Bank because they were mis-selling the data. So actually, because that culture is not there in India, we still feel how this could be done. But in US, in some of the European countries, like because they have GDPR, the things have become very streamlined because the definitions of how to use the data are very clear. So I think we as a society, I know we are still kind of evolving. We are not there yet, and that's exactly what the point of this bill is. That once it is formalized, once the bill comes in, people are also clear how to how to operate. But this bill will actually give you the whole framework of defining and then kind of using and then kind of transmitting the data for specific purposes.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
this bill when comes in, I think will be really helpful for you to build that architecture, build that in your whole data management policies of your company.
Yeah, thanks. One more question I wanted to check is that in this fintech space, are the technologies like uh, differential privacy already playing a role? Are people like when they give out data, when a bank shares data externally, are they planning to use these things? Are these terms being talked about? I just want to know because for specifically for differential privacy, as well as when you compute based on the data that you have collected, are you thinking of using some things like confidential compute or secure enclaves?
Okay. So if I understand your question, you are saying that, I mean, some of these kind of aspects of the bill, are they really implemented in the Indian context, right? Is what you're
Or
asking.
does the bill also talk about some of these technologies as a step, like because these are important technologies, like now in like differential privacy is going to be used to give out the census data in US, but are there such things also talked about in either, I don't know, either GDPR or our PDP, that okay, when you give out data and the data corresponds to some kind of a statistics or aggregates, you give out using differential privacy or such technologies?
So I
Or the
think
bill is
both these bills are very specific to, I think, very specific to individual data. It's not very aggregate. So as I said, right, in the definition itself, it's very specific to your personal data. It's a personal data bill, right? So when you talk about aggregates and you talk about statistics and all, I don't think the coverage of the bill would be around that, because when it comes to statistics and aggregates, I think then it becomes a census. It no longer remains a personal data. So for example, if your age, your financial status, your health condition, right, is your personal thing, that is very private, that I can't reveal for you individually. But as a society, maybe I can kind of aggregate the data and say, okay, Indian population is subject to diabetes, 15% of the people are diabetic and all. That becomes a more of a census. So it doesn't remain more personal, right? It doesn't get covered in GDPR, right? It's very specific to individual.
okay. Okay.
Makes
And
sense?
one last question within the fintech space, again, like when we are talking about banks sharing data with each other, again, are technologies like, again, say multi-party compute, where you do collaborate for a specific task between the banks or different financial institutions without revealing the raw data? Again, is this something that you see which is already being talked about, or it is, I don't know, again, because these are some
So
of the research
again,
topics that we
yeah,
are looking at, so we just
sure,
wanted to know
sure. No,
what
I
is the
think
current.
it's a very pertinent question, and why I will touch upon is this. See, what happens is when you collect the data, right? So, for example, you are HDFC Bank and you are collecting the data for a car loan, right? And now tomorrow you are using that data for something else, right? So, in your source itself, if you would have again documented what that data may be used for, right? And I think that's the most important catch, because your consent here, what the word consent is very important, right? So if somebody consents to, I agree that okay, you can use this data for XYZ purposes, then banks can do it, right? So there's nothing wrong, because as an individual, I've given the bank the consent to use that data to actually market more products to me, or maybe upsell or cross sell other products to me, or maybe do anything. So again, the definition of at the source when I'm collecting the data is very important, that what are you taking consent on, right? And if you see, a lot of these private banks in India are very smart, and some of these fintechs are also very smart, because time to time you would see they would update their privacy policies, right? And they would send you a mail saying that okay, do you agree to this privacy policy? Until you agree, you actually cannot operate the account, right? So which means that, I mean, ultimately you have to agree to those things, right? And once you agree, you actually give your consent to use your data again in any form or purpose, right? So I think they're being a bit smart right? But I think this bill may also give some awareness to people, right, which is not there right now. Because right now, a lot of people just say, I agree, right? Even I do that, right? A lot of time, because if I'm opening a bank account, I may not read 3-page privacy or consent, whatever they have, right? Nobody has time, nobody has energy, and maybe 90% of the people don't even understand what privacy is, right, in India. So I think all these factors actually contribute to all of this.
Oh, thanks. Thanks.
I think there is one more
Yeah,
question.
thank you.
So,
Yeah, Harsha, could you unmute yourself and ask your question? Mr. Harsha Krishna. Okay.
sure. I think the question is that
Namrata, could you please unmute Harsha?
I think he's saying he's not able to unmute
Okay,
because I
so
think maybe
maybe
muted by the admin.
maybe. Okay, so anyway, as you could see the question, which is very
Yeah. So it says
okay.
that can we go beyond fines,
Yes,
right? To
this is
actually,
very
as
interesting.
was the case with US Bank, right?
Yes.
So there are a couple of things, right? I mean, like the Indian jurisprudence is I mean, anyways, very different operating from US, right? So I think how this would work is, I think initially there would be some laxity in getting the organization understand these rules, right? Because I think this will be new. So a lot of companies, a lot of organizations would still be catching up on how they need to operate this. So I think everybody will be on a learning phase, right? And as with every law, right, initial 2-3 years, everybody will be learning. The bureaucrats may be learning how to deal with the cases, right? The companies may be learning on how to kind of save the data and take consent. Individuals may be learning on how to give consent, and right. So I think it will be a learning process. But once I think this becomes more of a business as usual, right? I think you will see similar kind of laws being passed or similar fines being made, because if there is any organization which is inadvertently kind of using the data or misusing the data, and as per the law, right, as per the Indian Penal Code, they will be kind of penalized. I don't see a lot of resistance to this, because I see a lot of companies are already on this path. They've already realized that privacy is integral to whatever they are developing, right? So if you see a lot of these, I mean, banking apps are now multi-factor authenticated. Um, they ask your consent time to time on everything that you do, right? So I think some of these companies are too smart enough to already build those now, so that they don't have to do a lot of work later. But I think time will tell on how I think we will proceed from here, right? So nobody can say how this will be, because the bill hasn't been passed, and I don't know what form the bill will actually get passed. And because there was a lot of resistance in terms of how things have been, because there are a lot of resistance from big tech, specifically startups, and there's a lot of cost of compliance, right? With all the we are just kind of reached 100 unicorn. I think these things will actually slow the whole thing, right? So Indian government is also taking a very cautious step, and I think time will tell on whether this will be we will have more fines, or I think we'll have some other structure to deal with the complaints. So let's wait for the bill to come in. I think then we'll see how this evolves.
Yes, thanks, Shiv. Any other questions? Shiv, I would like to ask you one question. Like, as a data exchange, we basically host the data from the providers and provide a framework where the consumers can, use that data. So, in essence, we are a data aggregator, right? At some point of time, we would also like to look at the data monetization aspects, right? So the provider has some good data and he wants to sell it in a very legal, and proper channel, proper way. So have you come across any such framework across the globe where, such systems are in place where companies or maybe the providers, which in our case are mostly the urban local bodies, right, or the cities, if I talk of smart cities, right? So have you come across any such, robust data monetization framework?
Yes, I do. So, I mean, if you see Google, right, mostly the revenue is around data, right? So I'm taking example of Google, but if you even see a lot of these startups, they are collecting user data based on consent of the individual. And once I think you have the consent, you can actually use the data for that purpose of monetization as well. So I think the word here is consent. So if we have the right kind of yeses from individual or entity which we are collecting the data from, and somebody agrees to it that, okay, you can use my data for monetization purposes, we actually can use the data, right? So there's no law saying that, okay, you can't monetize the data. You can monetize the data, and there are a lot of startups which are only built to start, I mean, like, which are only doing business only on monetizing data. I've seen one kind of map based company, right, which actually collects the rider information, right? So for example, you have a Swiggy driver, right, which is going to a location, and he may traverse a certain path on his way. So what happens is, because he has a device which is more GPS enabled, right, they are tracking its location, and they are saving those streets, right, and they're identifying those streets and then saving the, I mean, which Google map may not have, right? So they are actually enhancing the maps to make sure that their data is so localized that you can actually track at a street level, at a mohalla level, at a gully level, the data which right now Google may not be able to provide you, right, in small towns, in small cities and all that, right? So what is happening is there's a lot of data collection which is happening at source with the consent of individuals, and people are actually building new products out of it, right? So I mean, this company has actually built very localized maps for cities, which no other company has in those many details, right? And they're selling it as a product in the market. So definitely we can do that. The only thing is, again, going back, do we have the right approvals and do we have the right consents of the individuals and the entities that we are collecting it? And if we don't have that, maybe it would be wise to actually go back and then ask additional approvals if you want to use that data for additional purposes. That's how companies work.
Yeah. Thanks, Shiv. It was very informative, and the takeaway from this session, I believe, is one of the things is that probably it's high time when concepts like data privacy are introduced at the school levels, because I believe a lot of education also has to be people have to be educated about what is consent, what is privacy, and all those things.
Correct.
So yeah, any other questions? I'll hold on for a few seconds. Okay, I believe there are no further questions. Okay, fine. So then if there are no further questions, let's conclude this episode of Data Dialogues. Once again, I thank Mr. Shiv Kumar Malhotra for his time and for his very insightful presentation and discussion, and thank you once again. So we close it.
Thanks.